On this Thursday night, a mask milestone in the U.S.
We have all longed for this moment.
Who has to wear masks and who doesn't? The new guidelines for fully vaccinated Americans. An Alberta oil sands worker and father of 8 fighting for his life.
My husband was so close to being vaccinated.
Plus, Ontario extends its stay-at-home order. And end of the road. Greyhound is shutting down in Canada. The bus company's slow death. And free burgers, cold beer, or cold hard cash.
Anything we can do to get the jabs in people's arms, I think is great.
The incentives to get inoculated.
Global National with Donna Friesen.
Good evening and thanks for joining us. We begin with a momentous decision in the U.S. and a sign of what life could be like when people are fully vaccinated. The U.S. Centers for Disease Control has released new guidance on masks. With some caveats, it now says those who are fully vaccinated can stop wearing masks indoors and outdoors.
If you are fully vaccinated, you can start doing the things that you had stopped doing because of the pandemic. We have all longed for this moment. That moment has come for those who are fully vaccinated.
It is a huge step in a country where almost 600,000 people have died of COVID-19 and where there are still dying. Almost 600 deaths were reported on average every day in the last week. There are big questions, too, about how people will prove they're vaccinated and who will enforce it. Our Washington Bureau Chief Jackson Proskow is with me. Jackson, this is big news. So big the president came out to talk about it without wearing a mask. Why did the CDC do this today?
Well, Donna, in short, it's because they feel it's finally safe to do so. Here in the U.S., 250 million vaccine doses have been given out in just the past 114 days. That covers almost 60% of adults with at least one shot, while 45% of adult Americans are now fully vaccinated. Compare that to just 3.5% of Canadians who are fully vaccinated. You can see the huge difference there. And with cases and deaths plummeting in the U.S., the CDC says it's safe for those fully vaccinated individuals to take off their masks, stop social distancing, even indoors. Now, of course, there are exceptions, namely planes, trains, and buses, which will likely still require masks until the fall. And it's not clear how long individual cities and states will keep their local mask mandates in place, or how private businesses will react, knowing that there are still a lot of unvaccinated people out there.
The rule is very simple. Get vaccinated or wear a mask until you do. It's not an enforcement thing. We're not going to go out and arrest people. I still believe the vast majority of the American people care about the safety of their neighbors.
The natural question, of course, is how do you tell who's vaccinated? While Americans have been given CDC vaccination cards, it's doubtful they'll be required to show them. There's no need for a so-called vaccine passport yet. Instead, the CDC is stressing the risk of going maskless to those who are unvaccinated. And Donna, they're hoping that showing all of the normal things that are possible with vaccination will be enough to encourage those who are still on the fence to get their shots. Donna?
Interesting strategy. Jackson Proskow in Washington, thanks. Canada is making progress on vaccinations, but we're nowhere close to having the majority of people fully vaccinated. And federal public health officials said today don't expect relaxed masking rules here anytime soon.
I would certainly say that for something like the face mask, I would say that would be probably one of the last things to go. I think it's just a good practice to keep on right until the fall.
In BC and Ontario, more than 50% of eligible people have now received one dose. And in both provinces, the numbers of daily new cases is dropping. Today, Ontario Premier Doug Ford said it is too soon, though, to lift the provincial stay-at-home order. He has extended it to June 2nd.
We need to do everything in our power to protect this summer for all Ontarians. My goal is to have the most normal July and August possible.
Ontario's top doctor says cases must be well below 1,000 per day before the stay-at-home order can be lifted. Today, the province recorded more than 2,700 new infections. Alberta has had the most active daily cases per capita for weeks now, and it still does, including outbreaks in the oil sands. Tonight, we hear from one woman whose husband became ill with COVID-19 while working at an oil sands camp. The 51-year-old father of 8 is now fighting for his life. Heather Yourex-West has his story.
It was an opportunity this Alberta woman says her husband could not afford to turn down.
This job was important to our family as COVID resulted in my husband's place of work being shut down over a year ago.
So in March, he headed to camp, taking a job at CNRL Horizon, one of thousands of tradespeople brought in by the company to help with maintenance, something the industry calls a turnaround. The site had been in an active outbreak since October, but when the additional workers arrived on site in April, the virus began spreading fast. A month later, hundreds of workers had become sick. On April 23rd, the father of 8 learned he was positive as well.
So immediately he was put into isolation at their isolation wing at camp.
Far from family, his wife could only check on her husband with phone calls and texts. But after 7 days, she said it became clear her husband was very ill.
I was just very concerned when he was able to speak only in 1- and 2-word answers. So I asked him to please call for medical help because he hadn't received medical check-ins, physical check-ins for 7 days at that point.
That night, he was taken to hospital in Fort McMurray, infected with the P1 variant from Brazil. He is now in the cardiac intensive care unit at Edmonton's U of A hospital, fighting for his life because he accepted a job.
What we are seeing, unfortunately, is the impact of some of the variants of concern. As in many other places in the province, we have seen transmission increase when variants of concern are introduced.
Workers are now being offered vaccinations on site, the province hoping immunizations will help bring these outbreaks under control soon. Little comfort for the thousands already infected and those watching loved ones struggle to survive. Heather Yourex-West, Global News, Calgary.
Internal discontent over Premier Jason Kenney's leadership has boiled over into an open challenge. The caucus chair of the United Conservative Party in Alberta has quit. In a letter posted on Facebook, MLA Todd Loewen says he's lost confidence in Kenney and asks him to resign. Loewen is one of 18 backbench members to push back against the restrictions Kenney imposed in April, which they believe infringe on personal freedoms. He writes, "We did not unite around blind loyalty to one man, and while you promoted unity, it is clear that unity is falling apart." Loewen will stay in the party, but says he's resigned as caucus chair so he can speak freely. Another sign of the times today, Greyhound Canada is shutting down all of its remaining bus routes permanently. It had cut routes in Western Canada 3 years ago. Now it's pulling out of the entire country. Mike Armstrong explains why.
It was 1 year ago to the day Greyhound Canada announced it was, due to the pandemic, suspending service. Well, on that anniversary, it is making it permanent. The announcement on the Greyhound Canada website quotes a senior vice president. Stuart Kendrick says a full year without revenue has unfortunately made it impossible to continue operations.
That's a bit of a shocker.
Bus travelers have been forced for a year to find alternatives like the train, alternatives that are often more expensive.
Less option is no good.
According to the company, it had been losing money in Canada since 2004. 3 years ago, it shut down operations in Western Canada. The old Calgary station is a vaccination center today. Well, COVID-19 was the final blow.
I think it accelerated it.
Transportation expert David Duvall calls the death of Greyhound Canada sad but not surprising. It was a service, he says, that could no longer be profitable based only on fares. If governments see a value or an importance in the service, they'll have to subsidize it, he says, or set up a new one. The biggest impact, Duvall says, won't be in the big cities where there are options, but in between, in smaller communities.
Those are the towns that are thinking, well, what's going to happen now to our accessibility and our connectivity to wider social, health, and economic networks that we need?
In a statement, the federal transport minister said Thursday the government, quote, will work with our provincial partners to explore options to address this gap. Now, some Canadians will see Greyhound buses post-pandemic. They just won't be Canadian. The American Greyhound company will be running buses to and from the U.S. to Vancouver, Montreal, and Toronto. Mike Armstrong, Global News, Montreal.
A coroner's inquest has begun into the death of Joyce Eshequan, the Indigenous woman who was subjected to racist insults in a Quebec hospital. The video she took at that time is disturbing. Eshequan was crying out in pain as staff insulted and mocked her. The 37-year-old mother of 7 died shortly after posting this. Today, her husband told the inquest she didn't deserve to have her life end that way. The family's lawyer hopes the inquiry will prompt concrete changes.
Did Joyce receive the health care that was required by her condition at the time of her death? And was racism, how did racism inform the decisions that were taken?
The inquest will hear from about 50 witnesses, including healthcare staff. The Federal Ethics Commissioner has finished his investigation into the We Charity controversy and has concluded Prime Minister Justin Trudeau did not break any conflict of interest rules. But the former finance minister did. Our chief political correspondent David Aiken has the details. David?
Well, Donna, Trudeau was calling it a win, but the PM's political opponents say his role in the We Charity scandal still stinks. Ethics Commissioner Mario Dion found Trudeau did not advance either his own or his family's interests when his government decided to award the We Charity a contract worth more than $40 million to run a pandemic emergency program to provide $900 million in grants to post-secondary students. And in making that conclusion, Dion cleared Trudeau of ethics violations in the We scandal. Trudeau had no public events Thursday, but in a statement he said, "This confirms what I have been saying from the beginning. My job as Prime Minister is to do whatever it takes for as long as it takes by providing direct support to people and businesses to get through this." Not so, says the opposition.
They breached ethics to help their friends, and it hurts students because students still haven't received the $1 billion promised to help them out.
Prime Minister Trudeau himself said he was in a conflict of interest in the We scandal, a perception of conflict of interest. His family was paid, family members were paid $500,000, and he was involved in a decision of a non-tendered contract worth hundreds of millions of dollars to those people who paid his family.
Trudeau's former finance minister, Bill Morneau, was found to have violated the conflict of interest law after Dion determined We Charity founders Craig and Mark Kielburger were legally friends of Morneau's, and Morneau's actions were judged to have advanced their interests. Commissioner Dion's findings come with no penalty, there's no fines, just another black mark on Morneau's time in office. Now, despite the ruling in Trudeau's favor, his opponents want to make the We Charity matter another ethics black mark against Trudeau to go with his other 2 ethics violations, the Aga Khan vacation in the Bahamas and the SNC Lavalin matter. Donna?
All right, David, thanks. The escalating crisis in the Middle East coming up, rockets, mob violence, and late tonight, Israeli ground troops move into Gaza. There has been another serious escalation in the violence between Israel and Gaza. Just after midnight local time, the Israeli army sent ground forces and tanks into Gaza, warning people within 4 kilometers of the border to stay in shelters. And there are reports Israeli airstrikes are intensifying. Diplomatic efforts are underway to try to de-escalate things, but hours before moving into Gaza, Israel called up 7,000 military reservists, and there's been mob violence on the streets in towns where Arabs and Israelis have long lived in peace. Eric Sorensen reports.
It was anticipated, and now Israeli ground troops have entered Gaza, a major escalation. Up to now, missiles had been sent into Gaza City overnight and again in the morning, targeting the Hamas military. Those civilian casualties, too, are climbing, and today a massive funeral procession for Hamas commanders. Just across the border, Israelis could see Hamas rockets lifting off from Gaza. Life is anything but normal here. In Lod, cafe patrons scattered as bombs fell, just missing this apartment. And Israelis, too, mourn the dead. But there is a disturbing turn in towns like Lod, where Jews and Arabs have coexisted peacefully. Protests by Israeli Arabs turned violent this week. This Jewish man says a mob attacked his car. A local synagogue was burned. But in another town, a car driven by an Arab was blocked, the driver pulled and beaten by Jewish rioters. It was never like this, says this Jewish resident. His friend adding, "We need to live here together." One analyst says the causes of the unrest run deep.
Towns and cities that had once been pretty much peaceful bastions of coexistence are now blowing up with direct hand-to-hand combat. What I would say is that there's an ongoing systemic issue of oppression of Palestinian citizens.
Diplomatic efforts have so far achieved little.
They want to see de-escalation. They want to see both sides sitting down, talking it through, and stopping the violence.
What we do need now is diplomacy, and this is the incredibly sad thing. While politics is being played and missiles are being thrown back and forth, there are people on the ground, children, mothers, fathers on both sides being killed.
Israel's prime minister elbow-bumped Israeli soldiers today. He said we continue striking Hamas and added it will take more time. It's clear now what Netanyahu meant as troops gathered on the Gaza border, and late Thursday night, Israel sent its military into Gaza. Eric Sorensen, Global News, Toronto.
The Garratts and the Michaels still ahead, the links between two stories of Canadians detained in China. Global News is launching a new series called China Rising. The podcast will examine how the Chinese government is allegedly targeting Canada and its allies, deploying a range of tactics, including hostage diplomacy. The most famous examples of Canadians being held in China are, of course, Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig. But they aren't the only Canadians who have been caught in the political crossfire. Jeff Semple spoke to Julia and Kevin Garratt about their experience and their advice to others.
For nearly 2.5 years, the two Michaels have remained out of reach. Canadian Spavor and Kovrig, accused by Beijing of spying. Their trials held behind closed doors. Their ordeal difficult to even imagine. But not for Julia and Kevin Garratt.
Our situation is very similar to the Michaels.
The Canadian couple lived in China for 3 decades before their arrest in 2014, accused of spying following the arrest of a Chinese suspect in Canada at the request of the United States. The Garratts were held in separate cells, interrogated for 6 hours every day.
They threatened execution many times.
They each kept diaries.
In John 15.
Kevin wrote Bible verses about hope, while Julia scribbled pictures of anything she was grateful for.
Like, I heard a bird outside. I heard like some chirping of a bird, so I drew like a few birds. Because the other alternative is you get lost in bitterness, anger, rage, and I knew that wasn't a good choice.
But as the months dragged on, their notes grew darker.
Like, you get into this more deep despair.
After 7 months, Julia was released, but not Kevin. Like the Michaels, his trial was also closed to the public, which he believes is actually a positive.
If it was a public trial, meaning there are spectators, it will not go away. They're going to make an example of you.
Kevin was later convicted of spying, but unbeknownst to him, political relations were warming. The Chinese suspect in Canada suddenly pleaded guilty, and Prime Minister Trudeau visited China amid talk of a possible trade deal. 2 weeks later, Kevin was released, reunited with his family. The Garratts say the government's quiet backdoor diplomacy helped to secure their release.
So their approach was extremely diplomatic, and so it wasn't in the media.
They're doing it differently with the two Michaels. Some quiet action, but more in the news and in their face.
But even when it seems insurmountable, their story is a reminder of how quickly the winds can change.
I think I would say you hold on. It will not last forever.
Jeff Semple, Global News, Toronto.
You can listen to China Rising on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, or wherever you get your favorite podcasts. A jab for the jackpot. Next, some $1 million incentives to get vaccinated.
You can get a vaccine at the game.
New York Governor Andrew Cuomo is offering a perk for baseball fans. Get vaccinated at clinics set up at Mets and Yankees games, and you not only get protected, you'll get a free ticket to another game. Most Americans under the age of 65 are not vaccinated yet, and there's a big push on to fix that. Easing the rules about masks for fully vaccinated Americans is one incentive. Jackson Proskow explains some others.
Did you say
free fries when you get vaccinated. I got vaccinated.
From free burgers and fries to donuts and beer.
There you go.
The push to encourage vaccination has turned into a personalized sales pitch.
Anything we can do to get the jabs in people's arms, I think is great.
So some states are paying people to get the vaccine. $50 in parts of Texas, $100 savings bonds in West Virginia, and then there's Ohio, where you can get a shot and win a lot.
That first number up tonight is 7.
5 $1 million prizes in a special lottery for the fully vaccinated.
You have the other group of people, though, who are not vaccinated, and the danger to them is even more great in some respects than it has been in the past because this variant is more contagious.
Canadians are getting a taste of it, even if they can't yet get their second shots. Montreal-based AECOM Timber will pay employees $350 once they're fully vaccinated. The University of Lethbridge is giving away free tuition to 9 students who get their first shot by September.
We are very committed to doing everything we can to make sure that we create a safe and healthy environment in the fall, and vaccinations are part of that.
You don't address vaccine hesitancy by buying compliance.
Some epidemiologists question the ethics of it all, believing social incentives promoting a return to normal are better.
Get vaccinated, you can do all these wonderful things like hug your loved ones and be in a room without masks and go to the theater, etc.
And when the Toronto Blue Jays play their home opener in Buffalo, New York, fans will get a grand slam of that kind of encouragement. A special section without distancing for the fully vaccinated, and free shots in the stadium for those who still need them. Jackson Proskow, Global News, Washington.
And that is Global National for this Thursday. I'll say goodbye tonight, wishing Eid Mubarak to Muslims in Canada and around the world who are celebrating the end of the holy month of Ramadan. We leave you tonight with some images of Eid prayers and celebrations from around the globe. Thanks for watching.